The Honorable Mayor Jorge Elorza.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman.
Good evening.
Good evening, and thank you for the consideration. And I want to thank every member of the committee for your thoughtful consideration of this piece of legislation. And in particular, I want to thank Representative Scott Slater and Representative Grace Diaz for sponsoring this bill and for their vocal and strong support of this issue. I start with the first premise that a strong capital city is important for a strong Rhode Island. As goes Providence, so goes the state. And the money that this transaction or a transaction pursuant to this would yield would allow the city to permanently, once and for all, shore up our pension system, which is currently less than 30% funded. Now, we introduced a bill last year, and we learned a great deal through these hearings, and we made a number of changes, but we learned a lot last year. As the representative just mentioned, this bill, unlike last year, does not create a new water authority. What it does is it authorizes transactions with existing water authorities, and they'll be permitted to enter into a transaction. And we can enter into these transactions, or would be able to, with other water authorities, operators, or regional water quality management district commissions. And as we've put this new piece of legislation together, we've been guided by three principles that were very much informed by the feedback that we heard last year. The first one is stabilizing rates. You'll notice that the piece of legislation before you caps rate increases. Can you hear me now? Thank you. You'll notice that the piece of legislation before you caps rate increases for the first 5 years following a transaction, and any rate increase will not increase the percentage rate increase that we've seen in the previous 5 years. So as you can imagine, rate increases just happen naturally, and we'll make sure that any rate increases in the future are no more than we've had in the past. The second major principle behind the piece of legislation you're reviewing is that there can be no compromise to water quality. Especially with talk about Flint still in the air, meaning Flint, Michigan still in the air, everyone is concerned about that issue. And I'll just remind folks that the issue in Flint was that they actually changed the water source. No water source is being changed here. We're simply looking at changing operations and management functions. And then the third major principle that's embedded in the piece of legislation you have is public oversight. I believe water is a public utility, and there should always be some public oversight of that important utility. This legislation maintains regulation and oversight. Upon completion of any transaction, the resulting entity will be a fully regulated public utility with continued oversight and regulation to protect the water quality of the system and ensure rate stability for customers. Now, there's been a lot of questions as to, can Providence do this? Does Providence actually own the system, or does it belong to the ratepayers? Look, we believe we own the system. Other people believe that we don't own the system. But what is clear are two things. First of all, that we own something, and we own something substantial. And what we would be looking to do is enter into some kind of lease agreement or operating agreement for that ownership interest that we have. And the second is, as the piece of legislation is drafted in front of you, the question of ownership is actually a moot point. Because if we do own something, it's simply a matter of entering into a lease agreement or an operating agreement for that ownership interest. The question of fairness comes up a great deal as well. And this is an area where I believe the City of Providence is treated very unfairly. As you know, Providence Water, first of all, Providence operating budget, we see absolutely zero of any revenue from Providence Water. It's a completely separate enterprise fund and is handled entirely separate from the city's operating budget. So we get zero from Water Supply Company. Providence Water sells both retail and wholesale, meaning that we sell retail to customers, and we also sell wholesale to other municipalities. Those other municipalities are able to take our water, mark up the rates, and all of that additional revenue goes into their systems. However, God forbid something disastrous happens to the water system one day and the bonds aren't being paid back. It's Providence that backstops all of Providence's water's debt. We are on the hook, and it's our credit worthiness that is at risk in case of a default. We get the downside, but not the upside. Providence has served as a good custodian of Providence water, providing water for a majority of our state's residents, and doing so at a highest quality, at a level of the highest quality, and at very, very subsidized rates. It is our work as custodians that has created so much of the value in the system. And then the last piece that I want to underscore is that this is not a bailout. Rather, Providence is seeking authorization to utilize an asset that we created, that we have managed, and that we have operated since its inception to address one of the most pressing financial challenges that we face certainly as a city, and that I would say by extension, we face as a state. It's no secret that if this legislation passes, the City of Providence will be one of the first to explore options to lease our water supply system or enter into an operations and management agreement. To be clear, Providence Water will not and cannot continue to operate under the city and provide water for a majority of the state forever. Failure to resolve our fiscal challenges will eventually result in very negative consequences for Providence Water and all of the customers. We believe this legislation is good for Rhode Island, but we are open to suggestions and happy to work with you and any outside stakeholders to refine this legislation to ensure that it serves all of our needs. This act will give Providence Water and the City of Providence the tools to get on a more sustainable path. At the same time, this legislation will maintain the quality and affordability for the 60% of Rhode Islanders who rely on this resource every single day. Last but not least, just to reiterate, Providence would never enter into a transaction that doesn't ensure the quality and affordability for all customers of Providence Water. I thank you for your time and for your thoughtful consideration of this legislation.
Thank you, Mayor. Are there any questions of this witness? Representative Giarrusso.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I ask my question, may I be marked in the affirmative for holding all bills?
As well as Representative Barros. Anyone else? And Representative Mendoza? And Representative Tabone.
Hey, Mayor, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, thanks. I'm just thinking, like, Providence Water Supply, can I assume that that's a nonprofit organization?
It's an enterprise fund. So it does bring in revenue, but all of that revenue is reinvested into the system. Nothing is extracted from it.
Okay, so now with that said, as a private enterprise is going to come in and they're going to lease the water there, so they'll be the ones selling the water, if I get this right. Now they have to do it for profit. So if they're doing it for profit, then why can't we do it for profit now?
That's a great question. The reason why we can't is because we're regulated by the PUC. So we're limited in how much we can charge in rates. In an alternate reality where you can charge whatever, all of that would be revenue. That's not what we're looking to do. We want to make sure that we're providing safe, clean drinking water at an affordable rate for our residents. The average resident in Providence, or who gets their water from Providence Water, they spend about $420 a year in clean water. You compare that to, let's say, Newport. In Newport, they spend about $820 a year in water. And so we're able to produce the cleanest, highest quality water almost in the country, and we're able to do it at very, very low rates. And we want to continue that. However, what other municipalities do, they take our water and they run their own separate systems. We're prevented from charging them anymore, but they're not prevented from charging their own residents more. And it's just an unfair system. So even without sort of extracting anything out of the system, we feel that there are significant revenues that the city can bring in simply by a reorientation of how the system is run. The last piece that I'll mention is we're working with a gentleman. His name is Stephen Goldsmith. He's the former mayor of Indianapolis, and he entered into a similar transaction when he was mayor of Indianapolis, and now he's a consultant that works with cities across the country that are looking to do this. We're fortunate that he's up in Cambridge, and he's been a close consultant on this. He tells us that as a rule of thumb, you can find anywhere from about 15 to 20% of efficiencies just by reorganizing these water supply systems into a larger entity. So for example, let's say that there's another public utility. There's been talk about Narragansett Bay Commission, or it could be some other entity. If they're digging into the ground, in there to fix one set of piping or tubing, why not just make the repairs for the clean water as well? They spend millions of dollars every year on engineering, on architectural renderings, on the actual excavation and all of the quote-unquote dirty work. Through economies of scale, and you can find these efficiencies that bring in more value to the system, and that's how the value to Providence would come from.
Okay, I mean, my primary concern with changing the way that it's distributed now is if I put my business cap on, what is the return on the investment? And then either they have to raise the rates, and I know you say we have a protection for 5 years, but what happens on the 6th year and beyond? And if it's not working out, if they can do better by investing in other things, a good business person would probably do that.
Well, after the 5th year, any rate increases would indeed be regulated by the PUC. So even if we bring some outside either utility or water supplier, they would not have carte blanche to come in and raise the rates because they want to make more revenue. That would be negotiated all ex ante or at the beginning in the lease agreement or operating agreement with the city.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Representative O'Brien?
Thank you for coming here, Your Honor. I just have a very... Oops, sorry. Thank you for coming here, Your Honor. I did the same thing. How does this affect other communities like North Providence, Johnston? Mm-hmm. I mean, how would this affect those communities?
So I think it would affect communities throughout the state in potentially 3 ways. Right now, there are 3 classes of folks as it relates to Providence Water. The ones who receive their water directly, the retail customers from Providence Water. Second, the ones who receive their water indirectly from Providence Water. We sell wholesale and then they get it from that water system. And then folks who don't get their water from Providence Water at all. They have another water source. And so the folks who get it directly, retail, those are the folks who are protected under the cap increases that we're including as part of this. So I believe that the impact to them would be minimal, if any. Second, the folks who get their water indirectly from Providence Water, we believe that perhaps over time, if we have a larger entity that's able to find economies of scale, Providence Water has currently already absorbed a number of other smaller water supply districts. And as they get absorbed, or as they have become absorbed, we're able to provide better rates even to those customers because maybe, to use Representative Giarruso's phrase, you put your businessman hat on. There's a certain element of cutting out sort of middle players and middle actors that are increasing the costs to the system. So we believe over the long term, this could actually lower rates for people who get their water indirectly. And then third, we know that there's an abundance of water in the northern part of the state, mm-hmm. and there's often scarcity of water in the southern part of the state. You look at folks in Newport that they spend almost twice as much in water per year as folks up here, and mind you, for lower quality water. If we have a larger entity with larger capacity to bond and a built-in customer base, perhaps they could invest in giant pipe to send the water down south. And we believe if they get Providence water, they could also get it at lower rates than what they're getting now, and they would get much higher quality water as well.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Representative Tabone, Representative Quattrochi, Representative McLaughlin. Representative Tabone.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor, thanks again for coming. So, so last year, well, first of all, in regards to revenue, do you guys have a projected amount that you would be aiming for if this could be implemented? And what would that do for you?
Well, thank you for the question. So, there's a certain level of uncertainty in how much revenue it would bring in. We did have an appraiser come in and do an assessment last year, and they valued the system at $420 million. Now, that $420 million, that's the value if you were sort of building it from scratch, right? The value of the pipes and all of that. Another, maybe even more important component to it is, how well of a system it is, how well the management structure is, how well it's run, the quality of the water, the rates that you are able to bring in right now. So our best estimate is anywhere from maybe about 300 million to 700 million. And I know that that's a wide gap, but that's our estimate. A big part of the value of the system is also determined by the language of the legislation that's passed. So, for example, the fewer restrictions that there are, the more valuable the system is. The more restrictions there are, the less valuable it is. So I know that's a big range, but those are the reasons for the range. Let's say that we sold it. Not sold it, but let's say there was a transaction for, let's say, $400 million. That would have the impact to our system to the tune of maybe about $30 to $35 million to the city of Providence's yearly operating budget. Now, what $30 to $35 million would get us, frankly, every year when, we're lobbying you guys and nagging you for, 1 million here, 1 million there. I mean, how valuable, every single dollar is. But $30 million, I'm sure you all can appreciate, how impactful that is. If we invested all of that into our school buildings, we would have the best quality school buildings in the entire country. That's how significant of an investment that would be. Or if we invested all of that into infrastructure, every single year forever, we would have the best infrastructure in the country. Those are the opportunity costs. I mean, there's other things that we can do. Like, for example, we all know that we have one of the highest commercial tax rates, real estate tax rates in the country for capital cities. If we had this 30 million of fewer expenses every year, we could instantly be competitive with all of our neighbors. We could do so much with that revenue. And if I may just add one more thing to your question, the city of Providence has come a long way. You look back 7 years ago, and the talk was still about receivership and bankruptcy in the city of Providence. Think of what Hartford and Connecticut are going through right now. I think it's a very fair thing to say that Hartford's importance, or I'm not sure that's the right word, but Hartford's importance to Connecticut is nowhere near as big as Providence's influence or importance to the state. And you all just saw that Hartford was on the brink of going bankrupt, and the state, I believe, subsidized them to the tune of about $500 million. So let's say nothing gets done, and we reach that brink once again where we're contemplating receivership and bankruptcy. The state, frankly, just can't and won't be in a position to just let Providence go under. The state at that point will have to step in, and then we will be talking about bailout. What we have in front of the committee right now, we have an answer to our long-term challenges in a once-and-for-all basis. It's not a bailout. All we're looking for is authority to monetize through a transaction an asset that either we own entirely or we own a significant interest.
Okay. In regards to, and just quickly on that one, you presented several options. Is there a priority as to the options you mentioned? Would you go into infrastructure or schools? I mean, if you start dividing that up, would it be sufficient to cover those areas, or would you go all in a certain area to offset? I know last year there was conversation of maybe putting it into the pension, right?
Yeah, so let me explain that. That's a good question. So the plan is to put all of it into the pension fund. So that is the plan. The amount that we pay into the pension fund is determined by how much we need to make up for the unfunded liability. So if we have this big chunk that goes into it, that means that our yearly ARC payment is reduced by about 30 to 35, and then with that 30 to 35 million, we can do it. Yeah.
Okay, last question, Chair. By the way, once you're going to start looking at improving your schools for by Pawtucket, we have the two best schools right now, right? So, and just to clarify, so Providence will sell to a city, and you guys can't, whatever revenues gets reinvested into the system. The city of Providence doesn't get it, but other cities sell it and then they put it into their budget to cover whatever it is.
I believe that may happen, and I can't speak 100% on that last point. I'm sure Jack Partridge, who's here, he can answer that question. But what does indeed happen is, so we sell at a subsidized rate. All the revenue that we get from those sales, they get invested into that system. When we sell wholesale, they mark it up. All of that revenue gets invested into their system. Now, I ask myself, why do we need a separate system?
Great. Well, Mayor, thank you so much for your answers, and Chairman, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Cartrochi.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
As I'm sure you can understand, Situate, which I represent, is has a big stake in this. So, has any research been done into the legalities of selling or leasing land acquired through eminent domain? Has research been done on this?
Explain the eminent domain part of it.
Well, Situate was taken over 100 years ago through eminent domain. City of Providence took it over, and from what I understand, that land is supposed to go back to heirs if there's any type of transaction. So that's why I'm asking if any research in.
Yeah. We've done a lot of research on that, and we've engaged a couple of local law firms to help us through that research. And the piece of legislation that we submitted this year is different from last year. If we were to sell the system, we think we own it, other folks think we don't own it. The truth is that we'll be locked in litigation for years upon years and years. And so we don't think that that's a smart thing to do, to sell the system. So the way that we structure this is that, we have been managing and operating the system since its inception. What we would do is enter into some kind of long-term lease or management and operations management contract. And that would obviate the question of who has ownership. So we wouldn't be locked in litigation for years upon years and years.
What if Situate decided to drag you into litigation over eminent domain?
I feel fairly comfortable that the issue as to whether Providence owns anything and whether we have the right to enter into a long-term lease agreement or operations and management agreement, that is on really sound and stable grounds. If the city were to go that next step and try to sell the system, that's where that question of ownership would come in, and I think we would be in litigation. But that's not the direction that we want to go in. But if I could say one more other thing, Representative. So last year when we started these conversations, I sat down with the City Council in Situate, and I do want to say that if a transaction like this were to go forward, Providence is very much willing to sit down and hear many of the concerns, and in fact some of the financial concerns by the town of Situate. And we're flexible, and we're hoping that we can come up with a resolution that works for Situate and works for Providence.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the language is very weak as far as protecting host communities to non-existent.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely a concern.
Yeah. We're willing to work on that.
Would it be accurate to describe the PUC and Rhode Island Division of Public Utilities and Carriers as sort of a consumer protection entity?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so I'm just curious, in the bill, you don't have it in front of you. Do you have it in front of you?
Not the whole, but I'm
So
familiar.
page 3, line 1 and 2, it's basically the public utilities and carriers shall have, they shall have no jurisdiction or authority over the power to approve, reject, or review in any way the transaction. So how does the public have any safety or peace of mind if they are taken out of the equation right from the beginning?
That's a fair question. So, yeah, to the extent that the PUC is seen as a consumer protection sort of group, I think the General Assembly is also seen as a consumer protection group. And that's why built into the legislation, we have the rate cap for the first 5 years. And so instead of the PUC regulating this, every single year, what the piece of legislation calls for or allows is for the General Assembly to be that consumer protection group and limit rate increases for those first 5 years. So under no outcome is there no oversight or regulation of the system. It's either the General Assembly or the PUC.
Okay, just one more quick question. Do you know how much, or if any, bond indebtedness Providence Water has at this moment?
I don't have it at fingertip knowledge, but we can get that to you soon. We can get that to
Because that would certainly figure into all these numbers, correct?
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, what I will say about that is I don't have the exact number, but the Providence Water's bonded indebtedness actually counts towards Providence's bonded indebtedness. The Treasurer's Office put a report together recently, and it speaks to the point that Providence backstops all of that debt. And so, God forbid something terrible happens to the system, it's our creditworthiness that's on the line. And when we have the credit rating agencies come in, they analyze how much debt we have. All of that Providence Water debt is on top of it. So on a yearly basis, that makes it much more difficult for us to go out and borrow, or much more costly for us to go out and borrow. But the truth is that Providence doesn't see any benefit from that. That goes to an entire separate enterprise fund that, we get the downside but no upside.
Okay, would this provide for host communities to possibly enter into, say, a lease or purchase?
We're very open to that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Now, Mayor, you have an obligation to get to, right?
There's nothing more important than this.
Okay. Representative McLaughlin. He does have an obligation to get to, so let's be concise with our questions.
Very quick questions, actually two of them. Thank you so much, Mayor, for coming here today. Quick question, how many other cities and towns do you actually service?
Do we service? I don't have the exact number. So it's 16? Okay. 16
communities. And you would thrown out a price $400. Is that quarterly or?
A year. So the average Providence Water customer spends about $420 a year.
Can you run a pipe to Cumberland? All right. All right.
I'll get on it right away.
All right. Thank you so much.
Representative Barros.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question would be brief. Mayor, thank you again for coming, and I know that you have to get to where you need to get to, but how many water districts are there?
So there are about 490 water suppliers in the state.
Wow.
Some of them are small and tiny wells, so just keep that in mind. But I believe there are 27 major water suppliers in the state.
Of which you supply to 16. You supply water to 16 of them.
I think it's 16 municipalities.
Correct.
So we are one of the 27 water suppliers, and we supply to 60% of the state. So the others 26 of them supply to the other 40%.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Any other questions of the mayor? Thank you so much, Mayor. We appreciate your time and your efforts.
I appreciate your consideration. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.